Lakota chief's daughter dying of fever. A scarred healer saved her and gained a husband. The lodgepole they tied the horse to was still warm from the day's sun when they came for me. I remember that, the heat of the wood under my palm when I grabbed it to keep from going down. Two men, Lakota, faces I didn't know, and between them something in Oglala I had to ask them to say twice because I was still half in the dark from sleep, and the one word I needed, the chief's word, the word for his daughter, didn't come to me until the second time through. Inchpay, that was her name. I hadn't spoken it aloud in 20 years, not to anyone, and I'm not sure why I say it now except that names matter, and hers always did. My name, for what it's worth, is Elias Cutter, was Elias Cutter then. Still is technically, though I haven't used it much in the years since, preferring the Oglala name that came later, Chante Chikala, which means something like the small heart, or the heart that keeps quietly, though some of them meant it hard when they first gave it to me and some of them meant it plain, and I've decided not to decide which. But I'm ahead of myself. That's an old man's habit. Let me go back to the night and the horse and the heat of the post under my hand. I had been in that part of the territory, the broken, cedar-dry country south of the Powder River, for maybe 3 years by then. I'd come west after the war, not the big war. The smaller, meaner one that nobody names in the same breath, just a town in Missouri, a bad spring, a set of decisions I made when I was young and scared, and didn't understand yet that some decisions follow you the way a creek follows a draw. They go where the land takes them. They don't ask your permission. My face was what it was by then, the left side, a burn mostly from a fire that took a supply barn in '63. There had been a man inside the barn who didn't get out, and the reasons that man didn't get out were complicated and involved me, and I had spent a good while deciding whether the fire on my face was punishment or coincidence, and I had settled on coincidence without much conviction. What the burn did, practically, was end a certain life and begin another. The face I'd had was ordinary. The face I had afterward was not. People looked and then they looked away, and that looking away told me everything about where I stood in any room, any town, any camp. I learned to be useful before they could decide I was a problem. That's how I learned medicine, not from a doctor, or not from one doctor, though I had a teacher for a time, a man named Aldous Pruitt who drank too much and knew more than any man I've met since about what happens to a body when things go wrong inside it. He taught me to see sickness the way a tracker sees sign, not the thing itself but what it does to what's around it, where the grass is bent, where the water doesn't settle right. I learned to use that eye in the territory. I rode where I was needed, and I was needed in poor places mostly, homesteads where there was no money for a real doctor, trading posts, now and then an army camp that would let me in through the back. I did not make a lot of money. I had a good horse and a canvas bag and hands that had learned to be steady in the doing of hard things, and that was enough. I was not a man who expected much. I had been working that summer for a trading post operation, 3 men, bad whiskey, and a set of ambitions that were going to get them killed eventually, but that's another story. I was staying in a leaning shed about 50 yards from the main building, close enough to be called on, far enough that I didn't have to look at them over supper. I had my bag, my horse, and a fire I kept small because the nights that summer were not cold enough to need it big. I kept it for the light. That's where they found me. In the shed, the small fire, the bag open on the ground beside me because I'd been checking my stock of willow bark, which was low. The 2 men, the lodgepole, the name said twice. Inchpay was sick, they said. High fever, 3 days. The medicine man had worked and the fever had not broken. Their chief, a man named Shunka Wichhashta, horseman, a name I knew from the territory though I'd never met him, had sent them to find the scarred healer who some of the Miniconju had spoken of, the one with the canvas bag, the one whose face was burned. There were not many of those. They'd found me in one night's ride. I asked one question, was she conscious? One of the men, the older one, heavyset, with a red blanket over his shoulders that he held closed with one fist, said she had been in and out all day. Earlier in the afternoon she had spoken. Not since sundown. I told them give me 10 minutes. I did not know, packing that bag in the dark, that I was packing it for the rest of my life. That is the kind of thing you only know after. What I knew then was that a fever 3 days running in the summer heat was serious, and that if she'd stopped speaking it might already be past what I could do. I knew that Shunka Wichashta was a chief of consequence, that his camp would be maybe 40 people, that I would be a white man riding into it at night to work on his daughter, and that if she died under my hands things would go badly for me. I knew I was going anyway, and that the reason I was going was not the danger calculation but the simple thing, the older thing, which was that there was a person sick and I had the bag. I am not telling you that to make myself sound good. I'm telling you because it's the truth, and it matters to what comes after. The ride took most of the night. They pushed the pace, but they weren't cruel about it, and by the time the first gray started coming up in the east I could smell the camp. Cookfires long gone cold, horses, dogs, the particular dusty sweetness of dried meat that I always associated with the Lakota camps. They kept their camps clean, cleaner than most of the white settlements I'd ridden through, which is something that surprised me the first time and didn't surprise me at all by the third. The older man with the red blanket, his name, I found out later, was Thathanka Chikala, Little Bull, though everyone called him by a camp name I won't try to spell, took me straight to the chief's lodge. Didn't announce me, just pulled the flap and said something inside and then stepped back so I could go in. I have been in a lot of sick rooms, lean-tos, soddies, bunkhouses, army tents. I have stood at a lot of beds and read what a body is saying when it can't say it straight. You develop a sense for it, the way a stockman develops a sense for whether, not certain knowledge, just a leaning of the gut toward what's coming. What I felt when I stepped into that lodge was close. She was on a low pallet near the fire which was built up high, wrong for fever. I knew that before I even knelt, and there were maybe 4 women around her, 2 of them older, one young, one who might have been her age. Her age was maybe 25, I found out later. I put her at 23 that night, looking at her face, which was flushed and sheened with sweat, and had the flat, distant look of high fever, the look of a person who is present in the body but not behind the eyes. A man was crouched at the far end of the pallet, not old, not young, with a face that was all concentration and no welcome. The medicine man. He had a rattle in one hand and a bundle of dried sage in the other, and he was looking at me with the particular expression that I had seen before in doctors who had been there first, which is the expression of a man deciding whether you are a threat or a help, and what he'll do in either case. I kept my eyes on him and took off my hat and held it at my side and waited. There was a big man behind me. I felt him before I heard him, just the change in the air of the lodge, the weight of someone who took up room entering a space. I turned enough to see. Shunka Wichashta. He was not a tall man, maybe my height, which is not tall, but he stood the way some men stand, like the ground under him was more solid than the ground under other people, like he had roots. His hair was black going gray and pulled back, and he had a face that had been through things and come out the other side and was not interested anymore in pretending otherwise. He looked at me the way you look at a horse you're considering, not cruel, just measuring. He said something, I caught about half of it. I said in Oglala, my Oglala, which was rough and grammatically uncertain, and probably offensive to a native speaker in the same way bad singing is offensive to a musician. I will help if I can. I cannot promise. I need the fire lower and I need water and I need room to work. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something to the women, and the fire was pulled down by half and one of the older women went for water, and they moved back from the pallet. The medicine man stayed where he was. Shunka Wichashta looked at me again with that measuring look, and then he sat down cross-legged on the far side of the fire and waited. I knelt beside her. The things I am about to tell you are not dramatic. I want you to understand that. People who have not seen real medical work think it looks like something from a stage show, hands flying, voices urgent, a moment where everything turns. It is mostly not like that. It is mostly close, quiet work in bad light, using your hands and your nose and your eyes to read what's happening, and then trying one thing and watching, and trying another and watching, and keeping the fear of being wrong far enough back that it doesn't make your hands shake. Her fever was high, high enough that her skin, when I put the back of my hand to her neck, felt like the outside of a lamp chimney. I checked her throat. She didn't resist, but she didn't respond much either, just a reflex swallow when I touched the back of her tongue carefully with 2 fingers. No swelling I could feel. I pressed lightly on her belly, which was something Pruitt had taught me to do, and she flinched at the lower right, which told me something, and then I smelled her breath, which was not the smell of the gut fever I'd been afraid of, and that told me something better. Not the gut, something else. I checked her legs, found it on the right calf, a small wound maybe 4 days old, a cut that had closed on the surface but was hot and hard underneath. An infection that had gone into the blood. That's what was driving the fever. Not the lungs, not the belly, not whatever the medicine man had been treating. A wound on the calf that had sealed wrong. I want to stop here and say something about the medicine man. His name was Chantahilla, Precious Heart. I learned it later and I thought it was a good name, actually. He was not a fool. The things he was doing were not foolish. He was working in a tradition that understood some things about sickness and healing that my tradition had only begun to catch up with, and he was doing them faithfully and with skill. What he didn't have was what I had, which was Pruitt's instruction in the particular thing that was happening, the specific knowledge of what a deep infection in the blood looks like, what it does, and what you have to do to stop it. That was not superiority. That was just luck of education. I looked up and found Chantahilla watching me. I pointed at her calf. I put my hand over the swollen place and I said the Oglala word for bad Shicha, and I pointed at my own blood and made a motion that I hoped meant through the body, moving, spreading. He looked at the leg for a long time. Then he looked at me and I saw him decide something, and he set down the rattle and the sage and leaned back. I have thought about that moment many times in the years since. What it cost him. A man who has been treating someone for 3 days, who believes in what he's doing, who has every reason not to yield to a stranger, choosing to yield anyway because the girl mattered more than his position. I respected that. I still respect it. I opened the wound. I won't go into all of it. I'll say it required a knife and it required draining what had built up underneath, and she came back to consciousness partway through and grabbed my wrist hard enough that I told one of the women to hold her arm. She didn't scream. I want to say that. She came up from the fever partly, enough to know something was being done to her leg, and she held my wrist and she didn't scream. She made one sound, one short, hard sound through her teeth, and then she pressed her mouth shut and she held. I looked at her face then. First time I'd really looked at it, beyond the clinical looking. She was looking back at me. I went back to the work. I packed the wound with a poultice, plantain and yarrow. I had both, thank God, and I had the willow bark tincture for the fever, which I got into her as best I could with one of the older women's help, tilting her head and giving it slow. Then I sat back. The medicine man began to work again from his side, quiet prayers, I think, and the rattle very low, almost no sound. I did not interfere with that. I wasn't about to. Shunka Witchhashta sat by the fire and did not move, and I sat across from the pallet and I waited. About 2 hours before full light, her fever broke. I know that sounds simple. It is the opposite of simple if you've been watching someone burn through the night. The moment the sweat comes, real sweat, the wet through soaking kind, not the dry fever sheen, is the moment the body decides to come back, and there is no medical action that causes it, not directly. There is only the clearing of the thing that was blocking it, and then the body does what bodies do when you give them the chance. It was her, not me. I need that to be clear. One of the older women made a sound, low, one syllable, and then there was a murmuring in the lodge, the quiet kind that means relief, and I heard Shunka Witchhashta say something I didn't catch, and I put my hand to her forehead one more time, and then I sat back on my heels and I was very tired. I was aware of someone looking at me. Her eyes were open. Clear for the first time, not all the way there, still foggy from exhaustion and the fevers leaving but present. She was looking at me with an expression I had learned over the years not to expect from strangers, which was just looking. Not at the scar, not around it or past it. Just at me, the way you look at a person you're trying to read straight. I said in my bad Oglala, "You had a bad cut on your leg. It made your blood sick. It is draining now. You need to sleep." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. I looked away first. I needed to check the poultice and I needed to not make a fool of myself, so I did the first thing and hoped the second thing would take care of itself. I stayed 2 days. Shunka Witchhashta did not ask me to stay. He didn't ask me to go either. He simply did not make the question available, which I understood in its way as a kind of answer. Food appeared. A sleeping place was arranged. Chantahilla came to look at the wound in the morning and in the evening of each day, and we worked around each other in the way of two craftsmen who used different tools on the same piece, respectful, careful, not speaking more than we had to, but not hostile. By the second day I thought we were something like all right. Inchpay Y came back slowly. By the afternoon of the first day she was awake and drinking. By the morning of the second she was sitting up and eating. Her mother, I identified her by the way she sat, the way she watched, that watchfulness that mothers have near sick children regardless of their age, brought food and sat beside her and spoke quietly. I checked the wound each morning. The redness was receding. The heat was going out of it. She would have a scar on that calf for the rest of her life, but she would walk on it fine, and in a week or two I didn't think the wound would need watching anymore. She didn't speak to me directly until the second evening. I was outside at the edge of the camp, not for any reason except that I needed to be outside and not in a lodge for a while. I had my back against the wheel of a wagon that had been there long enough to start belonging to the landscape, and I was not doing anything in particular. Watching the light go out of the sky the way I did in those years, which was a habit of the solitary, filling the evening with whatever is in front of you because the inside of your own head is not always good company. She came out on her own, no one with her, walking carefully because the calf was still sore, and she came and stood about 10 feet from me and looked at me. I stood up, old habit with women, you stood up. She said something that I had to ask her to repeat. The second time she said it, I caught most of it. She was asking about the scar. I had been asked about the scar 100 times in 100 ways, crude, kind, pretending they weren't asking, pretending they were asking for someone else. It is the question that never stops once you have a face like mine. I had my answers ready like I always did. A fire, I said. A barn. She nodded and said something else, and I got about 2/3 of it, which was, "Does it still hurt?" I said no, which was the truth mostly. The nerve damage had taken care of the pain years ago, which is one of the body's meaner gifts. The same injury that marks you is the one that makes sure you can't feel it anymore. She looked at me for another long moment. Then she said something I had to ask her to say 3 times, and the third time she said it slowly, with the patience of a woman who has decided to be patient and means to hold to it. And I got it. She said, "You did not look away from me when I woke." I stood there with the wheel of the wagon against my back and the dark coming on, and I didn't have anything smart to say to that. So I said, "No." She said, "Most people look at me and look away." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because of my father." And then I understood. Not the scar conversation at all, or not only. She was the chief's daughter, and the chief's daughter exists in a kind of gap between things, too important for easy friendship, too present to be invisible, looked at constantly and seen around the edges, never straight. There is more than one way to have people not look at you. I had mine written on my face. She had hers written in her father's name. I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, I did not know whose daughter you were when you woke up. I knew you had a high fever and a bad wound on your calf. She was quiet for a moment. Then she made a sound that I realized with something like surprise was a laugh. Short, almost involuntary, like she'd been caught at it. I said, I'm glad you're better. She said, I know. She went back inside. I left on the third morning. Shunka Witchhashta came out when I was saddling my horse. He stood and watched me for a moment, and then he said something and waited for me to understand it. And when I looked uncertain, he said it again, slower. He said, you worked well. I said she was strong, that helped. He nodded. There was something else working in his face, not warmth exactly, or not yet, but a recalibration. The kind that happens when a man has decided something about you and then finds out he was partly wrong and is in the process of deciding again. I had seen it before, but not often, and not with a man of his standing, and I felt something shift in my chest that I didn't try to name. He said, you may come back to check the wound. I said, I will. I wrote out. I came back 3 times over the next 2 months, the way you come back to check a wound, necessary, professional, each visit with a purpose. I checked the calf. The scar was forming clean. I did not need to come back after the second visit, not really. But Shunka Witchhashta had said I may come back, and I was holding that with both hands. The third visit I had no medical reason for. I brought more willow bark, which they didn't need, and we both knew they didn't need it. Shunka Witchhashta accepted it without comment and gestured toward the camp. She was with 2 other women at a fire, working something with her hands, hide scraping, I thought at first. But when I got close enough, I saw it was a repair on a piece of tack, a bridle that had cracked at the cheek piece, and she was doing it with the particular concentration of someone who cares about the thing she's fixing, not performing the work but actually in it. She looked up when I stopped. I said, how is the leg? She said, it itches. I said, that means it's healing. She said, I know that. I said, I know you know that. She looked at me for a moment, then she said, why did you come back? I said, your father said I could. She said, he says a lot of things. They don't all bring people back 3 times. I didn't have an answer for that either. I was noticing, not for the first time, that she had a way of saying things that got right to the ground of a matter, no circling, no polite approach from the side. It should have been unsettling. It was not unsettling. It was the most comfortable kind of conversation I could remember having in years, which tells you something about the years. I said, I wanted to be sure the wound was right. She said, is it? I said, yes. She said, then you have no more reason to come. Long pause. I stood there with my hat in my hand and the sun on the side of my face, the burned side, which was warm in a numb kind of way that I had stopped noticing until that moment, standing there being looked at straight. I said I could find a reason. She looked at me for a while. The other 2 women had gone very quiet and very still, in that way women go when something is happening that they're watching carefully. She said, you could. I put my hat back on. I said I'd be back in 2 weeks. She said, bring something useful. I said, I'll bring coffee. She said, that's useful. I brought coffee. Over the next 6 months I came back, I don't know how many times, 12, 15. I kept a rough tally in my head for a while and then stopped, the way you stop counting a thing when it becomes ordinary. I brought what I could, coffee, sometimes salt, twice a small quantity of traded cloth that I'd gotten in exchange for setting a broken arm at one of the homesteads east of the camp. I did not bring useless things. She had made that a rule and I held to it. What happened in those months was not dramatic. I want to be careful about that. There was no single conversation, no single night, no moment that I can point to and say that's when the thing changed and everything after was different. It was more like weather moves into a country by degrees, the light shifting, the smell of the air, something in the pressure changing. You don't notice a day when it happens. You just notice one morning that the season is different than it was. What I can tell you is what I learned about her, which is this. She was her father's keeper. That's not the right word, but it's the closest I can get. Her mother was alive and well, but it was Inchpay who sat at her father's side when he had councils, who managed the small logistical things of the camp's life. The disputes about grazing, the allocation of supplies, the quiet work of keeping 40 people from any number of disasters. She did it without being asked and without being thanked, the way women do that work, the way it's always been done, and she was sharp about it. Quick to see where a thing was going to go wrong before it got there. She was also funny, I want to say that. She had a wit that came out sideways, dry, sudden, delivered with a face that gave nothing away, so that the first few times it took me a second to understand she'd made a joke, and by the time I'd caught up she was looking at me with that flat expression, and I could see the laugh inside it. She found my slow comprehension of Oglala consistently funny. She found most of my reactions to things funny, actually. She laughed at me more than anyone had laughed at me in years, and I found, somewhat to my own amazement, that I did not mind. I learned her full name in those months. Inchpay means, roughly, the moon that strikes or the striking moon. There's a quality in it of light that comes sudden, unexpected in a dark place. I thought about that name more than I should have. I thought about a lot of things more than I should have. My Oglala improved significantly. I want to give her credit for that. She had no patience for polite incomprehension. When I misunderstood her, she found a different way to say it, and then another, until the meaning was sitting in front of me too plainly to miss. It was the same way she did everything, actually. Direct, without cruelty. Clear about what mattered. About 3 months in, she told me what she'd heard about me before I arrived that night with the fever. That some of the Miniconju called me straight-handed, meaning my work was good and I didn't cheat. That some of the people at the trading posts called me other things, some of them involving the scar. That her father had heard the straight-handed version and the other version, and had sent the men to get me, because the straight-handed story was the one that had more witnesses behind it. I said, "What did you think of the other version?" She said, "I think people call things ugly when they're afraid of them." I sat with that for a moment. She said, "Your hands are not ugly." She said it the way she said most things, not soft, not performed, just as a fact being placed on the table. Then she went back to whatever she'd been doing. I rode home that evening with something in my chest that I hadn't had there in a very long time, and which I was too old and too careful to call by its name just yet, but which was warm, and which did not leave. The trouble came in the late fall. I had known there were men from the eastern settlements watching the camp, watching several of the Lakota camps in that stretch of country, looking for any reason the army could use to move on the treaty provisions. I had seen them twice, white men I didn't recognize, once at the trading post asking questions about the Oglala chief south of the Powder, once on a ridge above the camp with a field glass. I had told Shunka Witchhashta both times. He had listened both times with the expression of a man who has been watching this particular darkness come on from a long way off, and is not surprised by its approach. What happened was this. In October, 2 of the chief's young men got into a fight with a party of drovers over a water source. A fight the drovers started, from what I was told, but that left one drover with a broken arm, and the story that got to the territorial agent was not the story of how the fight started. The story that got there was the one that got written down, and the one that got written down had the Lakota attacking without cause. They sent 4 soldiers to the camp to question Shunka Witchhashta, not to arrest anyone, just to question. But 4 soldiers and a territorial agent coming into a Lakota camp to question the chief was a thing with a particular smell to it, and everyone in the camp understood the smell, and the 2 days before they arrived were the tightest 2 days I'd spent in that country. I was there. I should say that clearly. I had come for a visit. This was around the time I'd stopped counting visits, and when the word came that soldiers were coming in 2 days, I did not leave. I want to be careful about why I didn't leave, because I have told this story to myself in a few different ways over the years. The honest version is, I did not leave because she was there, and I was not leaving her while there was trouble coming. Her father met me the evening before the soldiers were due. We had never had what I would call a long conversation. He spoke some English, better than he let on, and my Oglala by then was passable. We spoke in a mix of the two and managed to understand each other. He said, "Why are you still here?" I said, "I thought I might be useful." He looked at me. He was wearing a blanket around his shoulders. The nights had gone cold, and he had his arms crossed inside it, and his face was doing the measuring thing. He said, "Or you did not want to leave my daughter while trouble came?" I said both. Long quiet. He said, "What can you do?" I said, "I speak English. I know the territorial agent. I set a broken finger for his wife 3 years ago. I can stand between. I can say what happened in a way they'll hear from a white man and not hear from you." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You are not afraid of being wrong about us?" I said, "I have been in this camp for 6 months. I know what I've seen." He said, "And if you speak for us, and they decide to make trouble anyway?" I said, "Then it goes where it goes, but I don't think it will." He looked at me for the last time that night with the measuring look, and then whatever he'd been deciding came clear in his face. Not warm, but something past it, something with more foundation than warmth. He said, "You have done right by this camp." He didn't say anything else. He went back inside. I sat there for a while with the cold coming on, and the stars coming out one by one, and something in my chest that was either fear or the opposite of it. I couldn't always tell them apart. The soldiers came in the morning. The territorial agent was a small, irritable man named Coffee who I had met exactly twice, once over his wife's hand and once at the trading post, and he knew me well enough to be surprised when he saw me standing next to the chief. I said, "I was here when the incident at the water happened. I can give you my account." He said, "You were there." I said, "No. I was in the camp, but I know the men involved and I know the camp's version of events, and I know the drover outfit that was at the water that day, and I know their reputation." The short version of what happened next is this. We talked for 2 hours. I gave my account. Coffee was not a cruel man. He was a bureaucratic man, which is different. A man who wants the paperwork to work out and is not particularly interested in whose account of the truth he uses to make the paperwork work out. I gave him an account that served his paperwork and was also true, which is not always a combination you can find, but in this case it was. He noted the account. He warned Shunka Wichhashta in the standard language about future incidents. The soldiers left before noon. I won't say I solved anything. I want to be honest about that. The larger things that were coming, the things that would come in the years after, that would change that country and those people in ways that still make me go quiet when I think about them. None of that had anything to do with what I could say or do. I was one man with a canvas bag and bad Oglala, and a good eye for what makes a territorial agent's paperwork easier. I did the small thing that was available to me to do. I did not make history. I just got through a morning. But that evening at the fire, Shunka Wichhashta sat across from me and poured me coffee from my own coffee and didn't say anything for a long while. And then he said in English, clearly, "I will not forget this." I said, "You would have done the same." He said, "I would not have been believed." I had no answer for that. It was the truth, and he knew it and I knew it, and the best thing I could do was not pretend otherwise. She came to me that night. Not in the way you might be thinking. She came to where I was sitting outside, alone, the way she had the first time, her calf long healed now, no careful walking, and she sat down near me. Not 10 feet away this time. close enough that I could hear her breathing. We sat for a while without speaking. She said, "You didn't have to stay." I said, "I know." She said, "Why?" I said, "I told your father I could be useful." She said, "You told my father. What do you tell me?" Long pause. The fire in the camp had burned down, and the stars were the kind of stars you only get far from anything, the deep sky kind, so many of them that the dark between looks wrong, like the dark is the mistake, and the stars are what's supposed to be there. I said, "You know why?" She said, "I want you to say it." I had not said it to a woman I did the math roughly, without wanting to do the math too carefully, more than 15 years. I had not expected to say it to anyone again, not because I'd decided not to, but because I'd stopped being in places where it seemed like a real possibility, and a man stops reaching for things he stopped expecting to find. I said, "Because I don't want to be anywhere you're not." Quiet for a while. She said, "That is a long way to come for a man who says he doesn't expect things." I said, "I didn't say I don't expect things. I said I stopped expecting things. There's a difference." She was quiet again. Then she moved closer, not leaning, not performing closeness, just closing the distance to something that felt like a decision, and she put her hand on my arm. Her hand was warm and direct, the way she was direct about everything, and she left it there. She said, "I told my mother about you 3 months ago." I said, "What did she say?" She said the straight-handed healer with the burned face. She said it like she already knew. I said, "And your father?" She said, "My father has been waiting for you to say something since about the 2nd month. He is not a patient man." I said, "He seems patient." She said, "He practices." I sat there with her hand on my arm and the stars overhead, and something settling in my chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not a resolved thing, a settling thing, like a horse that's been standing too long finding the right weight on its feet. The ease of being where you're supposed to be. I said, "I should speak to him." She said, "You should." I said, "Tomorrow." She said, "He's awake now." I said, "It's the middle of the night." She said, "He's been awake for 2 hours. He doesn't sleep well when things are unresolved." I laughed. I hadn't laughed in a while, and it came out a little rough, but it came out. She looked at me with that flat expression and the laugh inside it, and I stood up and offered my hand to help her up, and she took it, and then didn't let go of it. She said, "Go talk to my father." I said, "You're still holding my hand?" She said, "Yes." We stood there for a moment like that, the two of us in the dark with the stars over us and the camp quiet, and I held her hand and she let me, and then she let go and I went to talk to her father. Shunka Wichhashta was awake. The lamp was low and he was sitting with a pipe that had gone cold, which meant he'd been sitting there a while. He looked at me when I came in and he didn't look surprised. I said my piece, not long, not flowery. I said, "I want to stay. I want to be here and I want to be with your daughter and I want to be useful to this camp and to her. I know what I am. I know what I'm not. I am not a young man and I am not a rich one and I have a face that makes people look away. But I do good work and I am honest and I will not leave her." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She has her mother's will. She has chosen already. You understand that?" I said, "I understand that. I'm asking you anyway." He looked at me with all of that measuring, and whatever he'd been measuring all this time came to its answer. He said, "You asked well." That was many years ago now. I live in the Powder River country still, in the same hard, cedar dry land, though the world around it has changed in ways I will not tell you about because it would take too long, and most of it makes me angry in a bone-deep way that isn't useful to anyone. I have a camp that is partly my making and partly hers. My Oglala is not rough anymore. Her English got good enough that she uses it to be funny at me when the mood takes her, and it takes her fairly often. Shunka Wichhashta lived another 11 years after that night. He died in the winter in his sleep, which is what I would wish for any man I respected. The last time I sat with him was 2 weeks before, just the two of us, the pipe, the lamp, and we talked about small things, camp things, the coming spring, the horses. He was not a man who made declarations. But when I stood to go, he held out his hand to me and I took it, and he held it for a moment and then let go, and that was enough. I think about the night I packed that bag in the dark sometimes, the 10 minutes I gave myself before I went out to the horses. What a man carries without knowing he's carrying it. I had that bag for 30 years, canvas, cracking at the folds, a set of tools and medicines that I'd added to and replaced and rearranged so many times there was nothing original left in it except the bag itself. I still have it. I keep it hung on a peg by the door. Inchpay Y asked me once, early on, maybe the second year, maybe the third, whether I still thought about the burn, the barn, the fire, the thing before. I said less. She said, why less? I thought about that. I said, I think I used to carry it because I was carrying it alone, and things are heavier when you're carrying them alone. She looked at me with a flat expression. She said, things are lighter when someone helps carry them. I said, that's what I said. She said, I said it better. She was right. She was right about most things, which I had learned early and had stopped arguing with because it saved time. She had her mother's will and her father's eye, and a patience for the long work of things, the unglamorous, faithful, daily work that I had looked for in people for most of my life without finding it often. I am not a man who was built for joy, exactly. That's not an easy thing to say, but it's an honest thing. I was built for the long, steady work, for the canvas bag and the bad roads and the sitting through hard nights waiting to see how it came out. I was not built for the easy versions of things, and she did not offer me easy versions of things. She offered me the true one. On our second winter, I came in from a bad ride 2 days out, a homestead 30 miles east, a difficult birth that had come good in the end but had taken a good deal out of me, and I was cold through, and I had grit in every crease, and I probably smelled like a horse. She was at the fire. She looked at me when I came in, read the whole story of the 2 days off my face, and she stood up and put both hands on the sides of my face, the burned side and the other, and she held it there for a moment and looked at me. She said nothing. She held my face in her hands the way you hold something you are glad is still there, and she looked at me, and the fire was at her back, and the wind was outside, and I put my hands over hers and held them where they were. That is the thing I carry now in the years since, in the long quiet of this country. Not the barn, not the fire, not the face that made people look away. That moment, her hands and the fire and the wind outside and the knowledge, for the first time in my life without qualification or doubt, that this was where I was supposed to be and this woman had decided so. I think about the peg by the door, the bag on the peg. The night I packed it in the dark and went out to the horse. Whatever I was carrying then, and whatever I was walking toward, I am glad I didn't know. I would have been afraid of getting it wrong, and you can't be afraid of getting it wrong when the thing you're walking toward is this. You just have to go out to the horse and ride.